Good evening. I am Christine Kirby. I'm the Assistant Commissioner of the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection for the Bureau of Air and Waste. And I'm very pleased to welcome you tonight to MassDEP's third stakeholder meeting to gather input into developing new provisions for including cumulative impact analyses, sometimes known as CIA, into certain categories of air permits. This meeting continues a very important process for the Commonwealth and MassDEP, and we want to ensure that all stakeholders with an interest in the regulations we eventually propose and adopt are engaged in this important process. During these ongoing meetings, we are discussing a section of the 2021 climate law that contained a section directing MassDEP to evaluate and seek public comment on incorporating cumulative impact analyses into certain categories of air permits and to propose these regulations within 18 months. Next slide, please. Tonight, for the agenda, we will be presenting MassDEP's air permit program, including the different types of permits that we issue, the permit process, or what's known as the plan approval process, examples of the types of facilities included in the permit types to give you an idea of scale, a discussion about what permits should require a cumulative impact analysis, but you'll hear more about that in a moment. Next slide, please. We'd like to review where we are in our process. MassDEP is holding monthly stakeholder meetings through April of 2022, and we will have conceptual models for discussion by early next year and a conceptual draft of the regulation by spring. We plan to propose regulations by October of 2022. That's MassDEP's process. And this slide also shows the MEPA process, the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act. MEPA has separate requirements under the climate law and is under a tighter time frame with the first phase of the regulations due by the end of this year. MEPA's requirements may use some of the same data and concepts that MassDEP's cumulative impact analysis may use. So we will be definitely continuing to coordinate our process with MEPA throughout the next year. Later in the presentation, you'll hear from MEPA Director Tori Kim, and she will give an update on the MEPA process later tonight. Next slide, please. So a key part of tonight's conversation is which permits should require cumulative impact assessment. Again, the new climate law requires that MassDEP shall propose regulations to include cumulative impact analyses for defined categories of air quality permits identified through the evaluation and public comment process. For the meeting tonight, we want to hear your input on which air quality permit should require a CIA. Next slide. So we've laid out some questions for discussion. We've posed 3 questions here for you to consider as you listen to this presentation. First, what types of air quality permits should require a cumulative impact analysis? Second, should a cumulative impact analysis be required only for air permits in or near environmental justice communities? And third, should a cumulative impact analysis be required if the air permit will reduce emissions? I'm going to come back to these questions at the end of the presentation, and we want to discuss the ideas raised by the questions. We're hoping that the questions will help you formulate your comments that would help you participate in the discussion tonight and going forward in our stakeholder process on CIA. We have reached out to the environmental stakeholder community, municipalities, the regulated community, environmental and business organizations, and especially environmental justice communities and organizations to participate in this process. And again, we're very happy to have you again here tonight. As part of addressing disproportionate environmental burdens, evaluating cumulative impact analysis is needed to ensure communities are not overburdened by projects that may negatively affect the environment and public health. So we will be exploring this complex topic, including cumulative impact analyses in the air permitting process with your help and insight. Thank you again for your participation, and I will now turn it over to Glenn Keith.
Thanks, Christine. So we're going to talk about permitting, and the first thing to note that permitting is a bit complicated. There are both federal and state regulations that affect permitting and many factors that go into determining whether an air permit is needed, what type of permit is needed, and what needs to be included in the permit. For instance, there are different types of facilities or pieces of equipment that fall into certain permit buckets or categories, and they can trigger different permit requirements. Where the facility is located is also important, has to be taken into account. Is it near a sensitive receptor? Are there other nearby emitting facilities? What will be emitted has to be taken into account. And there are regulations that apply specifically to types of pollutants, for instance. So certain pollutants have certain requirements. How much will it be emitted in terms of emission rate or tons per day or tons per year, which again can trigger certain permit thresholds and lead to certain permit types. And then how will emissions be controlled, whether through operational practices or add-on pollution controls or both. All of these factors go into a permitting process and affect what type of analysis and permit is needed. Next slide. So to start, I want to give just a very brief high-level overview of federal and state air permitting regulations to provide a little bit of context before we get into specific permit categories. Next slide. So while Massachusetts has had its own clean air laws and regulations for many decades, every state air permitting program is also affected by federal EPA regulations. Under the Federal Clean Air Act, the US EPA has established national ambient air quality standards for 6 common pollutants, which are shown here: ozone, particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, and lead. There's a nationwide requirement in the Clean Air Act that every area of the nation meet these standards. And these standards are updated every 5 years by EPA, and they have generally become more stringent as new science is added to the analysis of the health dangers that these pose. So EPA has many different regulations aimed at reducing these 6 pollutants. For example, vehicle emissions, or how much volatile organic compounds can go into a pan of paint. But they also have an air permitting program for major, larger or major sources. So the Clean Air Act establishes a partnership between EPA and states, where EPA establishes nationwide air quality standards and programs, and then states have to develop plans to meet those standards, including state air permitting programs for major sources, but also for minor sources, which is a requirement in order to meet these standards. In addition, EPA has also established hazardous air pollutant or air toxics regulations that set emission standards and pollution control technology requirements for major and minor sources. EPA has not established national ambient standards beyond the 6 criteria pollutants, for instance, for hazardous air pollutants, but instead has decided to address that problem through technology standards that apply to different types of facilities, like such as a large chemical plant would have one type of air toxics regulation, and all the way down to an emergency engine is also subject to certain air toxics regulations. And then EPA also requires operating permits for major air sources. And these compile all the permitting and applicable requirements that go with that apply to a source to clarify the requirements and to make compliance easier, and to make requirements easier for the public to understand by having everything in one permit. Next slide. So MassDEP has promulgated several sets of air quality regulations to meet Clean Air Act requirements, but also based on state clean air laws that go further than the federal laws. MassDEP protects air quality in many ways. Tonight, we'll be talking about the stationary source standards and permits. Our regulations also have general provisions regarding nuisance prohibitions that address noise, dust, and odor. We have vehicle programs such as the inspection and maintenance program. We all take our car to get inspected every year to make sure the engines are running white so that there aren't excess emissions. We also give out grants for the purchase of electric vehicles, charging stations, and cleaner vehicles and engines to help transition the fleet off of fossil fuels to cleaner engines, because that will reduce not only greenhouse gases, but conventional pollutants. We also monitor the air in Massachusetts statewide. We have a network of monitoring stations, and we have many greenhouse gas reduction programs that also have been developed. But tonight, again, we're going to be focusing on the stationary source permits. Next slide. So with that very brief overview of federal and state framework for air quality permitting, we can talk about the different types that MassDEP issues. Next slide. So in general, DEP stationary source air permits apply to a source, which could be a facility or a project or a piece of equipment that's being installed in a facility that has the potential to emit air pollutants above certain thresholds. Not all stationary sources of air pollutants require a permit. If you have potential emissions that are below the permit thresholds, you don't need a permit. A good example is even home heating equipment would be a source of emissions if you have an oil-fired boiler for your home or natural gas, but it's too small. It doesn't meet DEP permit requirements. Larger boilers might. So, and the other thing is emissions. If a source meets certain emission caps and other operational requirements that are established in MassDEP's regulations, this is called permit by rule, then a permit is not needed. And this applies to certain categories of very small sources. And if you follow the requirements in the regulations, then you don't need a physical permit. And I'll give some examples of that in a moment. Some permits do not require upfront approval. These are compliance certifications. And these are, again, similar categories of small sources where the regulations spell out air quality requirements, and the source or owner of the source must certify to DEP that they are meeting those requirements. And again, I'll give some examples. Next slide. Oh, actually, hang on. And then finally, another thing to keep in mind is a source may have several different pieces of equipment that emit pollutants with different permits, compliance certifications, or no permit. So in a typical permit for a facility, they may have had to get one type of permit when they built the facility, but then if they do add another piece of equipment, they'd get a different type of permit. And they may have a source that meets one of the compliance certification standards, and they might have that as well. So in the air permitting world, you can have multiple permits for a single facility, and each permit is limited just to the piece of equipment that's being installed. And that the reason for that is that you know, when we look at each piece of equipment, we have to determine what the best controls are. And determining how to control a natural gas boiler would be very different than how to control a manufacturing coating line. And then finally, all sources are subject to air regulations, whether they require a permit from DEP or not, are subject to MassDEP inspection and enforcement. So some of these sources that are under the regulations, they don't need a permit, but MassDEP does inspect the sources to make sure that they're complying with the performance standards in the regulations. Next slide, please. So here's an example of some permit by rule sources. And again, this is where we have a section of regulations that specify emission caps to keep these sources small and use limitations. Then if the source meets that, as well as record keeping and monitoring of the equipment, then no physical permit or MassDEP approval is required. Some examples include paint spray booths, rock crushing equipment replacement, biotech surface disinfection processes, temporary boilers, small solvent degreasers. Again, this is only for small sources that have emissions below certain caps that are set in the regulations. Next slide. Compliance certifications. This is again where our regulations specify the air pollution control equipment or performance standards and other requirements. And then someone could install one of these types of sources with no upfront MassDEP approval required. But what they would do is then be required to submit a certification to DEP saying that they met these standards. And there's a number of sources in this program. It's referred to as our Environmental Results Program, or ERP. So for example, dry cleaners, if they're using perchloroethylene, they have to submit an annual certification to DEP. They have to use certain type of equipment. They have to monitor it and meet performance standards, and then certify that they've done so every year. And then MassDEP inspects a certain number of dry cleaners every year to ensure compliance. Commercial printing is a category subject to this compliance certifications if they're using inks or solutions with volatile organic compounds. And again, they submit a annual certification. Emergency and non-emergency engines and turbines. This is, if you qualify for this, it's a one-time certification. You can install the engine and then you submit the certification to DEP stating compliance. And then small boilers, where this is a one-time certification as well. Another example is fuel dispensing facilities or gasoline stations. Gasoline stations have to meet certain standards for capturing vapors from gasoline when the tanker trucks fill the underground storage tanks. And they submit annual certifications of compliance to MassDEP. And we wanted to mention these smaller sources that don't require DEP permits, because these might be some of the sources that you all are familiar with, or you see them in your neighborhood. And they are regulated and have to meet air quality standards, but they do not require a permit in the traditional sense. Next slide, please. All right, so this slide shows an overview of the types of stationary source permits that require upfront approval from MassDEP. These are sometimes referred to as pre-construction permits because you need to get the permit before you can construct the facility or the project or install the equipment that's subject to the permit. So you'd apply to DEP, DEP would review that, and you would have to have an approval, written approval, before you could then construct the source of air emissions. So the majority of permits that MassDEP issues are called plan approvals. And there's two types. There's limited plan approvals, which in general are for smaller, simpler sources, such as a small boiler burning natural gas in a school or a university. Might be big enough to require a limited plan approval. Comprehensive plan approval is generally for larger, more complex sources. So this would include anything that's above thresholds for the limited plan approval, all the way up to including major sources. And then the largest or major sources of air pollution trigger additional requirements that are federally driven. And these include non-attainment review for any facility that is in an area that is not in attainment of any of the criteria pollutants. So for Massachusetts, we actually attain all of the 6 criteria pollutants. However, because Massachusetts is located in the ozone transport region, which was established by the Clean Air Act, we have to act as if we're in non-attainment for ozone. So if you're emitting a major source emitting major amounts of nitrogen oxides or volatile organic compounds, you'd be subject to non-attainment review. And that includes more stringent controls and also pollution offsets. The other federal program is prevention of significant deterioration, and that's for a facility that's in an attainment area or for attainment pollutants, and it again triggers additional analysis. And in Massachusetts, we have our own non-attainment review regulation for prevention of significant deterioration. We implement directly the federal regulation through a delegation agreement. These major sources also trigger operating permits. As I had mentioned before, applies to all major sources, and there are certain other sources that also need operating permits. Another type of stationary source permit is emission control plans. These are needed to implement new requirements at an existing major source, and we'll come back to each of these later. And then finally, wanted to mention a type of permit that's a restricted emission status. And this is where a facility already has a permit generally, and they want to take a voluntary cap on emissions to avoid major source designation. Next slide. So now we're going to get into a little bit more detail on these permits. So this slide shows the federal and Massachusetts permit thresholds, and this is to give you a sense of the scale or size of the emissions that trigger the different categories of permits. So federal major source thresholds that are applicable in Massachusetts for volatile organic compounds and for nitrogen oxides, it's 50 tons per year. So for those two criteria pollutants, again, because we're in the ozone transport region, 50 tons is set as the level. These are both pollutants that result in ozone. They're referred to as ozone precursors. And then for any other criteria pollutant, the other 4 or 5, it would be 100 tons per year would be major source. And then EPA has set major source thresholds for hazardous air pollutants. So if you have the potential to emit an individual single hazardous air pollutant, it's 10 tons per year. And then any combination of hazardous air pollutants is 25 tons per year. So this gives you a sense of the size of what would be considered a major source under both federal and Massachusetts regulations. And then in addition to those thresholds, we have our own thresholds. So for the comprehensive plan approval, it's any potential emissions greater than 10 tons per year, all the way up to and including the major source levels. So even if you're a major source, you would get a major CPA. Anything below 10 tons, but above 1 ton per year would trigger a limited plan approval. And generally that 1 ton per year is fairly low compared to other states. Massachusetts has some of the most stringent standards compared to a lot of other states. Next slide, please. Okay, so comprehensive plan approvals. Again, these in general are for the larger, more complex projects, and the thresholds are listed here. Basically, the plan approval regulations treat fuel combustion or fuel utilization and process emissions, the first 2 bullets there, differently in terms of thresholds. So fuel utilization is combusting any kind of fossil or solid fuel, and the thresholds aren't based on tons per year emitted, but based on the heat input of the fuel combusted that would be in the equipment. So the fuel combustion thresholds based on the magnitude of the heat input the equipment is designed to combust. And it's based on fuel type. For instance, natural gas has 1 versus distillate oil versus other types of fuel. And examples of facilities or pieces of equipment that would trigger this is large boilers, furnaces, obviously power plants, waste combustors. And then for the process emissions are non-fuel combustion. So this again could be a manufacturer with a coating line. They're creating products and they're coating that, and the coating has VOCs, and they have a potential to emit more than 10 tons per year of volatile organic compounds from that coating line. So that would trigger a comprehensive plan approval. There's also one other category for any non-emergency engine or turbine that can't comply or does not want to comply with the compliance certification option. They have the option to get a comprehensive plan approval. And so even though some of these may be small, if they don't go with the compliance certification option, they must get the comprehensive plan approval. One of the things that's required in the plan approval is requires best available control technology. So each piece of equipment that emits emissions gets evaluated and has to install the best available control technology. And that's based on looking at control technology nationwide, even worldwide. And what that does is it creates over time more and more stringent controls. So it's a technology forcing standard. The permit would require that all state and federal requirements must be met. In addition to best available control technology, there may be specific federal air requirements or state requirements that are apply to the facility in terms of the air that have to be met. The permit would state that nuisance cannot be created, so any proposed project can't create excessive noise, dust, or odor. And DEP has begun to implement enhanced outreach to environmental justice communities upon submission of an application of a comprehensive plan approval. This was begun last year. All of these comprehensive plan approvals do require a public comment period, but that's at the proposed decision stage. So even prior to that now, if you're going to apply for a permit, you have to create a fact sheet describing the project, and DEP will do enhanced outreach to any affected environmental justice communities. So they have an opportunity to learn about the project while it's being reviewed by MassDEP and can better participate in the public comment period. Comprehensive plan approvals also generally require air quality or air dispersion modeling to determine how the pollutants will be dispersed and to ensure that they meet the National Ambient Air Quality Standards as well as air toxics health guidelines. And sometimes if noise might be an issue, sound modeling could also be required. Next slide, please. So there's two types of comprehensive plan approvals. If you're below the major source thresholds, you get a non-major, and that's considered a minor source from a federal perspective. So there's the major sources and the minor sources, and then major if it's above the major source thresholds. And this category is also results in different fee structure for each of these types of permits, higher fees for the major. As I mentioned, the air dispersion modeling is used to demonstrate that the criteria pollutant emissions will not exceed National Ambient Air Quality Standards. And then if there are toxics emissions of concern, to make sure that the emissions from the source would meet air guidelines. And sound modeling would identify any impacts and demonstrate the mitigation of any suppressible sound. And then just note that comprehensive plan approval for a simple project may not require air dispersion or sound modeling. For instance, if there's no emissions increase, or if it's a facility that's not near receptors and noise wouldn't be an issue, then sound modeling would not be required. So it's dealt with on a case-by-case basis. But for the most part, at least air dispersion modeling is required. Next slide, please. So for limited plan approvals, again, generally these are for smaller, simpler projects. The thresholds, again, are divided between fuel utilization and process. For fuel utilization, it's based on heat input or hour of fuel combusted. An example would be a boiler rated at 30 million British thermal units per hour of natural gas. So the trigger into an LPA for a boiler is 10 million up to 40 million. So above 40 million would be a CPA. So 30 million would only need a limited plan approval. For process emissions, it's potential emissions greater than 1 ton per year and less than 10 tons per year. And again, an example would be coating operation that has the potential to emit 8 tons of volatile organic compounds per year. If it's greater than 10, then it would be a comprehensive plan approval. Similar to CPAs, limited plan approvals do require best available control technologies. They have to meet all state and federal requirements, can't create a nuisance. These rarely require air quality modeling. They're smaller sources, and there's a lot more known about them in terms of what their emissions impact could be. But in some cases, if there are sensitive receptors that could be affected, then air quality modeling would be required. And then limited plan approvals do not require a public comment period in the regulations. Next slide. So this chart just shows the two types of plan approvals by comparison. And again, you can see that they have the different thresholds. They have a lot of the same requirements in terms of control technology, best available control, meet all other requirements. The limited plan approvals don't generally require modeling They don't require a public comment, and enhanced outreach right now is only for major or the comprehensive plan approvals. So this is something to keep in mind as we think about and talk about, what types of categories of permits should require a cumulative impact analysis. Next slide. So I just want to touch on some of the other permits that we mentioned. Emission control plans. These are much less common. And these are really only triggered when an existing major facility is subject to new requirements that DEP has established. So usually a CPA is triggered if the facility is proposing to construct something and increase emissions. But if they already have their permit, they're not doing that, then DEP establishes a new requirement, the mechanism to require compliance with the more stringent standard is an emission control plan. So they will, the plan, once there's a new standard, the facility has to document how they will use either pollution control technologies or operational strategies to reduce emissions to meet the lower standard. And this is really geared toward just certain categories. So there's specific requirements for emission control plans for municipal waste combustors, where they have to meet lower standards that get established from time to time, and then also existing major sources of nitrogen oxides and sources of volatile organic compounds. There's also one other emission control plan requirement in the regulations that applies to the power plant CO2 or carbon dioxide trading program. But this emission control plan isn't relative to how much emissions they can emit. It's just to establish a monitoring plan for how they're going to monitor the CO2, because they have to report that to the department. Next slide, please. And then in terms of the operating sources, which are required for the major sources and certain other sources, an operating permit does not establish substantive requirements, but it's a compilation of all requirements that apply to the source that are already established in permits the facility has received, as well as other applicable requirements that are spelled out in various federal or state regulations. For any new facility that triggers the need for an operating permit, they must apply for it within 1 year of starting operation. And once they have the operating permit, it's good for 5 years, has to be renewed at the end of the 5 years, and they have to apply for that renewal at least 6 months prior to the expiration of the existing permit. And there's, I think, about 111 sources in Massachusetts that have operating permits. Next slide. And as I mentioned, for all comprehensive plan approvals, MassDEP does require enhanced environmental justice community engagement, as well as for the emission control plans. Both of these types of permits have public comment periods as well. And the engagement includes the early outreach to any potentially affected communities and the preparation of the permit fact sheet in the application. Next slide. Okay, and I think what we'll do there, I've covered a lot to just describe the different types of categories that MassDEP has and to give you a sense of the size. But we can pause now and see if there's any questions before we continue on. Joanne's going to give you some examples of some of these types of permits. So if there's any questions, you can type it in the chat or raise your hand. Colby,
Hello,
do you
Glenn.
see?
I'm not seeing any questions.
Okay.
So we can go ahead and move on to Joanne.
All right. So Joanne.
Okay, great. So my name is Joanne Morin. I'm the Deputy Director of the Air and Climate Division. And I'm going to go through some examples of the different permits that Glenn has gone through to give you a better visual sense, and also just to actually describe some permits that we actually have issued, that the different regions have issued. So here's 4 pictures of different things that would be under a limited permit approval. The upper left is a smaller project, is what commonly referred to as a baghouse, and is one of the more frequently used pollution control technologies used for particulate matter. The upper right is a medium-sized boiler. The threshold for a limited plan approval that Glenn just described would be this kind of a boiler would be very typical in a limited plan approval. And the bottom two are emergency generators. The left is the actual engine that you can see. And then typically there's a casing around it in many circumstances, and it might look like something on the right, but the actual engine is on the left. So Glenn spoke about compliance certifications. He mentioned that these come as part of our environmental results programs, and these sources submit compliance certifications that certify that the source is complying with the specific air pollution control equipment or performance standards and regulations, as well as operating requirements or testing or record keeping. And we can see here in terms of the number of compliance certifications we have in our programs now, the majority are emergency engines, as well as the fuel dispensing facilities, which are gas stations. And then the remainder are boilers, printers, and dry cleaners, and a few non-emergency engines. In terms of stationary sources that have limited permit approvals and comprehensive permit approvals, we have a total of approximately 1,200 facilities with either limited or comprehensive plan approvals. As Glenn also mentioned, some facilities might only have LPAs. Some might only have one or more CPAs, or they might have a combination of both permits. And you can see here, we have split out those different types of facilities with the different types of permits. So over the past 5 years, MassDEP has issued an average of 61 limited and non-major comprehensive permits per year, to give you a feel for kind of the flow through approximately of the number of permits that might be issued. It does vary it can vary quite a bit. Major comprehensive permits are issued much less frequently and often are associated with a federal permit. There are 111 facilities with federal operating permits, and as was mentioned, the renewals only are required every 5 years, and so you can see that those do not come up as frequently, and there's only a number of them that occur each year through the permitting process. So here's some examples, actual examples. In terms of, we made the names generic, but these are actual permits that we have approvals for. So the first one is a precious metal processing. And what do we mean by that? Is that this facility offers metal refining and recycling for gold, silver, platinum, and other precious metals. And they applied for an approval for adding a new silver refining line, and the approval included the use of an existing wet scrubber, and it also included NOx or nitrogen oxides emission limits to the 1.34 tons per year, and that's why it was under a limited plan approval. The second example is for a commercial laundry, and that commercial laundry routinely launders uniforms and shop towels, and they were replacing and adding replacement and addition of 3 new dryers. And the approval not only specified emission limitations that you can see here for the dryers, but also had requirements for pollution prevention as well. The third example, a medical device manufacturer, and what's meant by that is like this manufacturer actually did knee replacement components, and they had increased production And so that those components needed cleaning with an isopropyl alcohol. And so when they increased production, they increased their use of that isopropyl alcohol for cleaning. And so that resulted in a net increase of 4.5 tons per year of volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. And so that required a plan approval for that increased production along that production line. So that would be because of the process threshold. The process threshold was exceeded. The another LPA that we are showing you here was for a new pharmaceutical manufacturer. It was a fairly new state-of-the-art facility, but it was relatively small. And its plan approval was limited to 35 production batches per year, and with emission limits associated with those production batches. The next example was a meat processing facility, and it had existing ovens controlled with a pollution control device called the thermal oxidizer, but it wanted to install an additional 2 new batch smoker ovens that would not be connected to that oxidizer, and therefore, it needed to have a plan approval for that and emission limits associated with that. Materials engineering firm was replacing a control device. It was replacing a scrubber for its acid washing batch. So those are some typical examples of some limited plan approvals. Now, for the bigger projects that would exceed the thresholds that Glenn just went through, either for a fuel burning device or for a process line for comprehensive plan approval. One category that we see actually quite a bit of is changing the status of an emergency engine to a non-emergency engine. And that may sound a little confusing, but we see it quite commonly. And that's because in 2016, the federal standards changed for emergency engines and what they could be used for. And what they couldn't be used for anymore was to be used in demand response programs where you can get incentives for coming off the grid during high load situations, such as in the summertime when there's a lot of demand for electricity, like when everyone's running their air conditioners and there's peak load on the electric grid. There are incentive programs to different businesses to reduce the load and come off the grid so that the grid isn't overloaded. And those are called demand response programs, and you can get incentives for that. And it used to be that people would run their emergency generators to do that. Well, in 2016, the standards changed so that some emergency engines are not as clean, and they wanted cleaner engines to be participating in those programs. And so you had to use non-emergency engines that adhered to cleaner standards. So, and that requires a comprehensive plan approval to do that. So that is what this category is. And we actually see quite a bit of these plan approvals. So we also have universities that might have a new boiler. And as Glenn explained, you could have an LPA might be needed for a very small boiler, but a comprehensive plan approval is needed for a very large boiler. And this at a university would be a boiler that is at an existing combined heat and power plant. And a heat and power plant, if you're not familiar with what that is it generates electricity and captures the waste heat and uses it for some productive heat use, like heating water in a boiler to produce steam. And the environmental benefit of a combined heat and power plant is that the system requires less fuel to produce the same amount of energy. So it's very much encouraged from our standpoint. So this is a fairly big boiler that's part of a combined heat and power plant that is producing a fair amount of electricity and heat at a university. So another CPA would be at a cemetery that is putting in 4 new additional cremation units, and crematories are a special category, and they always require a comprehensive plan approval. Farms produce a lot of manure and other waste, like a dairy might have a lot of milk waste. And these can use a digester, an anaerobic digester, to break down that material into a biogas. And that biogas can be burned in an engine to produce electricity. And that's what this comprehensive plan approval was used for. And then this example, the final example on this slide, was this CPA was a new bag house to control particulate emissions for municipal waste combustor. So as you saw, there was also a bag house as an example for an LPA. Again, this technology is used across the industry. So a relatively small one would be a threshold for an LPA, but this would be a very large bag house, and this would be a threshold that would need a comprehensive plan approval. So a few more examples would be, as I just described, a combined heat and power plant. It's a fairly sophisticated power plant, an engine, heat recovery, and so forth, would exceed the thresholds needed for comprehensive plan approval. So that's one of the examples. For a landfill, landfills have to often, if not all the time, have to control the gases that are building up from the decomposition of material in the landfill. And they burn that gas in a flare, or then also produce electricity from collecting that gas. But in this case, it was collecting the gas and burning it in a flare, and that was a comprehensive plan approval. This manufacturer had a new solvent-based coating for their golf balls, and that required a number of different changes in their processes. It required a new spray booth. It required some operational changes, a new mixing procedures and cleaning procedures and so forth. And that would not only exceed the thresholds, but require a comprehensive plan approval. And the final 2 examples were in an aviation manufacturer where they had 3 existing engine test cells and had changed. It had some contracts for those jet engine test cells and had an existing comprehensive plan approval, but their contracts had changed and they needed to modify those those test cells because they had changed their contracts. And so that would, that changed their production, how they were going to use those test cells, the emissions from those test cells and so forth. And that would require a new approval. And then finally, very large projects, you can imagine a power plant, new 350 megawatt natural gas fired large turbine and power plant to produce electricity would require comprehensive plan approval and the required federal permits as well. So just to see a couple of pictures of some of these things that we just talked about. This would be a typical engine housing for landfill gas that is not only collecting the gas, but burning it and using it for the generation of electricity. This is a picture of a farm with an anaerobic digester that is being used to produce electricity. This is a fairly large combined heat and power plant at a hospital. So you can see it's a fairly significant project and quite a bit of equipment, and combined heat and power plants can be quite sizable and complicated. And then, of course, an electric generating plant is a very large and significant project. So we are going to move into our questions that we'd like to have some discussion with, and Glenn and Christine are going to join us again, but from the climate law that MassDEP shall propose regulations to include cumulative impact analyses for defined categories of air quality permits. So hopefully we've been able to give you some background to think about this, and the questions that we had asked at the beginning: what types of air quality permits should require a cumulative impact analysis? Should a cumulative impact analysis be required only for air permits in or near environmental justice communities? And should a cumulative impact analysis be required if the air permit will reduce emissions, which is not uncommon? Glenn talked about changes to regulations that will reduce emissions through emission control plans, but also facilities may reduce their production, they may change their production, or they may be changing what they do, or they may want to not, there may be a new federal requirement that they do not want to have to comply with, and so they may voluntarily want to constrain their emissions so that they do not have to comply with the federal requirements. There's lots of reasons why we may get a plan approval that is actually reducing emissions and not increasing emissions. I want to point out before we start discussion that we have placed on the website these questions in a survey mode. We haven't done this yet, and we're hoping to do it maybe going forward if this is successful. But it's a Survey Monkey. Hopefully you've heard of that before, but all you do is you click on this link and those questions will come up, and you can enter your input and comments into the Survey Monkey. And we're doing this so that you could provide further input, or you could provide the input that you put tonight. You'd like to document it further, or you'd like more time, or you think of something further beyond the discussion tonight. So we're hoping to try to afford you more opportunity to provide your input. So we encourage you to also provide input through this survey after the meeting. So I'm going to put this, we'll go back to the questions, but just as a summary of kind of where we've been on these slides is, and how you could think about these questions is the factors to consider. Limited plan approvals are simpler sources. Air modeling is really required. No public comment required. Non-major comprehensive plan approvals are larger complex sources, and air modeling is required. Public comment is required. Major comprehensive plan approvals are the largest, more complex sources with air modeling and public comment. And then we had briefly talked about emission control plans are really limited to existing sources, and they're really plans for reducing or monitoring emissions. So we were speaking to maybe, these are factors considered and whether they should be included. So, so here are the questions we're asking, and we open it up to questions.
This is just a friendly reminder for audience members. If you would like to submit a question, please raise your hand and I will go ahead and unmute you. We'll give it a few more seconds to see if anyone wants to submit a question. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions at this time, so we're gonna move on to Tori.
Okay, Tori Kim, thank you.
Okay, great. Hello, everybody. My name is Tori Kim, the head of the MEPA office within the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. So MEPA stands for Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act. As some of you might remember, I did present an overview of the MEPA program at the introductory session of this stakeholder series The reason for inclusion of MEPA in this stakeholder effort is due to a parallel mandate that was placed on the MEPA program, as was mentioned earlier, through the climate legislation. That portion of the climate law is not identical to the section that relates to DEP. It does not use the term cumulative impact, for example, or cumulative impacts analysis, but we felt that there was enough overlap in the types of analyses and methodologies that we are now being tasked to implement in the MEPA program, that it made sense to include references to MEPA throughout. And as was referenced earlier, we are on quite a quick time frame, so we're a little bit ahead of the DEP process. We've already put out draft regulations for comment with the goal of meeting a statutory deadline of the end of the year for promulgating our first set of regulations to implement a similar type of analysis through the MEPA program. So the comment period has already ended on the regulations. However, we have convened an advisory committee and engaged in a stakeholder effort ourselves. And we are about to put out some guidance documents that spell out in more detail what this type of analysis of EJ impacts would look like at MEPA. So given that this meeting was scheduled and it's very close to the time when we are about to put out these documents for comment, we thought it made sense to reintroduce MEPA to this process and to give a preview of the interim framework that we are considering for our program. So I have a few slides here just with a reminder of an overview of the program and how it works, and then I'll move on to a preview of some of those developing approaches. So MEPA is a very broad program. It definitely goes beyond a particular permitting framework like DEP air. It's an old framework that's been in place since the 70s, and it was put into place before the big Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act permitting programs came into being. So the concept, which is similar for the federal MEPA program, which is the counterpart at the federal level, is that whenever there's any form of governmental action, so under federal MEPA, it would be a federal action. Under MEPA, it's largely state action. So this could involve state permits, for example, that there needs to be a comprehensive environmental review of those impacts before the project moves to permitting. So we are definitely not a traditional permit. We don't approve or disapprove projects, but the review process that happens at MEPA serves as a precursor to permitting before a project moves forward to obtain their individual permits. So it's a broader level, higher level review process where we're looking at alternatives to the project, including a no-build alternative, and public participation and transparency are key components. Oftentimes, MEPA is the only way that a member of the public may be able to weigh in on the benefits of a particular project. Next slide, please. So a few statistics here. As I mentioned, we have a very broad mandate. So we're not looking at any particular type of project. Real estate projects are pretty frequent types of filers, transportation, coastal resiliency, infrastructure projects like energy, water, wastewater, solid waste, et cetera. So there are often a whole host of state permits associated with these types of projects, but it goes beyond any particular project type or any particular polluting source of any kind. Our general stats in terms of numbers of filings have been fairly consistent over the last 20 years. We range from about 200 to 250 filings per year. We did do a little bit of data analytics as we were looking forward to the climate legislation coming into getting passed in terms of the number of filings that may be located near EJ communities. Now, of course, the definition of EJ population was not in place for the last 20 years. So we looked at projects that were located in municipalities that contained at least one EJ census block as it is currently defined. And we found that at least 60% of filings, not necessarily projects, but filings were located in these communities. In the last 2 years, the number of filings has remained relatively constant for about 250 filings per year. We are anticipating this number will go up as a result of the climate legislation and a result of the new process, as I'll explain in a bit. And about 80% of new projects that are filed are only required to undergo what's called an ENF review process. ENF stands for Environmental Notification Form. So this is a process involving projects with lower levels of impacts where they are required to file a notification form with us, and the project undergoes a 30-day review period. And for reasons I'll explain, we're again anticipating this number to change because these projects now will be required to undertake a lengthier study process through the filing of environmental impact reports. Next slide, please. So these are some of the program rules. As I indicated earlier, MEPA review is needed if there's a form of, it's called agency action, typically a state action of some kind or a state permit. We have set out in regulations certain review thresholds. So not every project requiring a permit undergoes MEPA. In our regulations, we've set either a lower level threshold for lower levels of impacts that require that shorter 30-day ENF review process that I described earlier. We also have what's called EIR thresholds. So these are ones having larger levels of impacts that are required to file not only an ENF form and undergo the 30-day, but also subsequent to that, file lengthier environmental impact reports, typically a draft and final report, each of which carries a 37-day review period. Next slide, please. And this is an example of some of the thresholds that we have in regulation currently. So again, just emphasizing that MEPA is looking at a broad range of impacts. So air emissions is certainly one of our thresholds, but we're looking at a wide range of other impacts as well, land, traffic, wetlands, et cetera. Next slide, please. Right, so as I said, the climate legislation made some key changes to our process. So first of all, every EIR, these are the lengthier impact reports that are filed, must now address public health impacts of the project in addition to their traditional environmental impacts. Next slide. Now, this is the key section that changes both the number of filings and the review process at MEPA. So the way it's phrased is that projects that are likely to cause damage to the environment, so not all projects, and this is a defined term in our regulations to mean those regulatory thresholds that are described earlier. So both the lower level ENF thresholds and the higher level EIR thresholds for those types of projects, if they are located within 1 mile of an EJ population, now must undertake an EIR review process and submit that lengthier impact report with the MEPA office. So this is the key section that will increase both the number of filings, because each project will now have to file not only the ENF form, but additional reports, but that number of projects that ended their MEPA review process after that ENF review period now will have to undertake additional study through the EIR process. The law also made reference to some projects, if it impacts air quality, that this EIR process is required if they're located within 5 miles of an EJ population. And in the draft regulations that we put out, we did attempt to define this term impact air quality as meaning both a major stationary source of pollution or mobile sources involving diesel-based traffic of 150 trips or more per day. So once this project is kicked into an EIR process, this is the rest of the bullets here get at the type of analysis that's required. So it's a 2-step analysis. One is an assessment of existing unfair or inequitable environmental burden and related public health consequence. And if the assessment shows that there is an existing burden in the community, then the EIR has to address whether the additional impacts of the project will cause a disproportionate adverse effect, and also whether the effects of climate change will increase or decrease. And I'll explain in a bit what our interim framework is in defining some of these terms and defining a methodology for these types of assessments. Next slide, please. And then finally, a key section of the climate legislation required enhancements in public involvement in MEPA review by EJ population. So if a project is reasonably likely to negatively affect an EJ population, then the secretary must require additional measures to improve public participation. Next slide. So our regulations, as I said, that we put out for comment recently, at this stage, they are reflecting more or less the bare bones requirements of those statutory sections that I just referenced. So it adds now that new requirement of an EIR for projects that are subject to MEPA review, but located within 1 or 5 miles of EJ populations. And then it defines what that assessment in the EIR must contain, both the existing burden and the disproportionate adverse impact. The regulations also, our draft regulations also acknowledged, however, that there is existing flexibility in review procedures. So projects are currently allowed to file an expanded ENF filing with a request that they be allowed to undertake a single EIR process. So we have added some language in our regulations acknowledging that even for these types of EIRs near EJ populations, if the impacts are truly minor and there is not much more analysis to be had, then at a minimum, a single EIR could be allowed for in certain circumstances at the discretion of the secretary. And then incorporating references to public health, as I said, which now is a required component of all EIRs. Next slide, please. All right, so based on all of these statutory changes, these are the key questions that we posed publicly at that first session of the stakeholder series in August. So these are terms that are not defined in the statute, and so it is up to the MEPA office to interpret them and to create some methodologies around what we mean by existing unfair or inequitable burden, what is meant by disproportionate adverse effect, and increases in climate change risks. For now, we're very much focused on the last bullet here. What is an interim approach that MEPA can develop while more refined methodologies are explored in part through this DEP stakeholder process? So what we've been telling our stakeholders is that we are subject to a statutory deadline. We're committed to meeting it. However, we do recognize that these concepts are complex and they require a lot of thought and a lot of scientific analysis. So while that process is ongoing, we are looking to put out what we view to be an interim approach, and that we will very much consider the prospect of a second phase regulatory review next year to refine methodologies as needed. But for now, it's an interim approach that largely attempts to use readily available public data and data sources to allow proponents to start conducting this type of assessment at MEPA. Next slide, please. Okay, so jumping into the interim framework. So public involvement is definitely a key aspect. We have developed, back in June, we developed a draft public involvement protocol that went out for comment, but because of the rulemaking effort that we anticipated in the fall, we're in the process of revising that based on comments received and expect to finalize that together with the rest of our regulatory package. Key components that are under consideration that have been expressed as key priorities and factors to consider. Number one is early notification. So even prior to filing with the MEPA office, considering requirements around community engagement and notification through local EJ groups and tribes. And I'm working closely with our EJ director to develop some resources around organizations and other individuals that can be contacted to help and assist in this engagement effort. And then the other key issue we've heard through our stakeholder effort is that meaningful engagement with EJ communities is key. So it's not enough to simply send out an email or attend a public meeting that, through local public elected officials, but meaningful engagement, identifying those pockets of EJ neighborhoods and being able to communicate in a way that's effective and that will garner and solicit true meaningful input from the EJ communities has been a key component of this process. And then finally, language services as well. There is an EJ map viewer that our EJ office has developed that you can use not only to identify the EJ populations, but to identify languages, specific languages that may be used in those communities. Next slide. So moving on to the actual assessment. So once the project is with MEPA, how will this assessment of EJ impacts take place? What shape will it take? Step one, as I indicated earlier, is an assessment of existing environmental burden, what is already there in the community. And I think this is the step that I see perhaps has the greatest overlap with what we're calling here the cumulative impacts analysis through the DEP process. The concept here is that there should be some assessment of what the cumulative impact of historic and current polluting activities may be on the existing community in order to determine the level of vulnerability, essentially, of the EJ population. Now, that's not a simple task to take into account every potential polluting activity throughout history or historically. So what we're attempting to do through our guidance document is to establish some key metrics, and again, looking at readily available mapping tools and other public data sources. So our own DPH has developed an EJ tool, this should actually say an EJ tool, that maps out vulnerable health criteria for EJ that it's overlaid on top of EJ population maps. So this gets at certain health criteria that's elevated at 110% of statewide. That could be a potential indicator of an existing environmental burden and public health consequence. The EJ tool also has additional mapping layers, including, for example, major MassDEP air and waste permitted facilities, 21E sites, and other similar layers that could be consulted, again, with the idea of assessing what is already there in the EJ community. The climate office at EEA also recently developed it's called an RMAT climate tool. And that this has already been pulled into the MEPA process. So every ENF filing now must attach a copy of a report that is generated from the climate tool, and it gives you a very easy ranking, low, medium, high of climate risks for these climate parameters that are listed here. So we would ask so this is a tool that's available to quickly assess the level of climate risk for the project site. And then finally, the EPA EJ screen. This is actually a fairly long-standing tool that the EPA put out many years ago. California and New Jersey already have similar mapping tools. Massachusetts does not have something similar currently, but the idea is simply, on a census tract or census block basis, it generates a percentile ranking in terms of the amount of burden in that neighborhood based on 11 environmental indicators. Now, we are cognizant of the fact that EJ Screen has been criticized for some of its inaccuracies, and their EJ indices do not align exactly with the definition of EJ population in Massachusetts. So we're still considering all of these various metrics and tools for their relevance in the MEPA process, but these are examples of publicly available tools that we think could be consulted in conducting this type of assessment on an interim basis. And then finally, any specific factors that may be identified during community engagement, we think are relevant and should be considered on a qualitative basis as well. Next slide. Okay, step 2. So once the assessment of existing burden is conducted, then the second step, of course, is to look at the additional impacts of the project to essentially assess whether there would be a disproportionate adverse effect. And one way to look at that is if there's already an existing burden, are you exacerbating that in a way such that one could argue that that's disproportionate because the community is already burdened with a certain level of polluting activities and environmental burden. Now, for this as well, I think we're still struggling with the fact that this is a very new assessment. There are not an easily available or off-the-shelf kind of quantitative methodology. So I think our current thinking is that this should be a multi-factor, case-by-case assessment of each project, considering these types of factors. So the nature and severity of the project impact. So an example that I often give is if a community is already burdened with a certain amount of air pollution, but the project is only fixing a dock in the area and just adding a small amount of localized wetlands impacts, that perhaps that's a project that could argue that they are not exacerbating those existing burdens. And again, this is a factor that underscores the fact that MEPA is looking at a wide range of projects with a very wide range of impacts. So the nature and severity of a particular type of burden in a community may not be the same as what is being added to that burden in the community. And then number two is the traditional view of disproportionate adverse, which is a simple comparison of impacts on EJ populations versus non-EJ. So are there impacts that are being added in a way that are specifically directed at or targeted at EJ populations versus non-EJ, again, thereby exacerbating those existing burdens and existing vulnerabilities. And then number three, considering project benefits that might reduce the existing environmental burden. Now, I think here, we wouldn't necessarily have in mind a netting out or net benefits approach where any type of project benefit can be viewed as offsetting impacts. But we certainly have heard of examples like ecological restoration or other types of resiliency projects where the core stated purpose of the project is to benefit the environment, improve conditions in the area. So certainly those are types of benefits that we think are relevant to consider when you're assessing this topic of disproportionate adverse effect. And then finally, climate change effects. Now, to some extent, climate change analysis is already occurring in the MEPA process. We just released that RMAT climate tool that I referenced earlier. So this is not necessarily a new component at MEPA, but the exercise here would be whether those climate change effects have a direct or specific effect on the EJ population, such as flooding. If there's a project that's increasing flooding risk, again, is that being directed at the EJ population would be an example of a type of analysis that would be considered. Next slide. Okay, and then finally, of course, the last step would be, to the extent a disproportionate adverse effect is identified, we would, of course, ask the proponent to consider alternatives that might avoid or minimize those effects or other mitigation that could offset those effects as well. And that's a traditional part of the MEPA process that I don't think would look different as compared to EJ impacts. But with the one change being that if there's mitigation proposed for the project generally, but there's an additional disproportionate adverse effect on the EJ population, we would ask the proponent to address that specifically and whether there's any other unique mitigation that could be provided to mitigate those specific impacts on the EJ population. Next slide, please. All right, and this is just an appendix that shows some of those available mapping layers that I referenced both within the DPH tool and EJ screen. So as proponents are consulting these tools, these are the types of environmental indicators and other layers that could be available. Next slide. So that's an overview of the interim framework. As I said, we are looking to get the guidance documents out for comment as early as next Monday. That was our original plan, but sometime very soon they'll be out for comment. And then we would be looking to finalize those guidance documents together with the regulations in by early December, so that they all go out at once. So towards the end of the year, and certainly by January 1, we're very much looking to have the new rules in place for projects filed in that timeframe. And as I mentioned earlier, looking into next year, we will continue to partner with DEP in this stakeholder effort and pull in any refinements as needed in a second phase effort that's a potential effort for next year. Next slide. Okay, and ways to participate. We have a dedicated email box for our reg review effort. You can subscribe to our listserv and ongoing updates on our website as well. So that ends my presentation. I'll kick it back to Joanne, and I'm also happy to answer any questions at this time. But please look out for those documents and comment opportunities. Our advisory committee meetings are also open to the public. We'll be taking a small break for us to finalize some of these documents, but those are all on our website, and anyone is free to attend those meetings as well. Joanne?
Are there any questions for Kim? Do you see any questions, Colby?
No, I do not at this time.
Okay, great. All right, I just want to emphasize, we appreciate everyone coming this evening. I know it might have been a difficult day for some of you with the storm. For further information, Tori went over her links. We also have the DEP links here for further comments, but we also have the survey link at the bottom of the slide. But we have where you can sign up for further notifications. We have our website link as well. So I just wanted to make that clear. And any further questions, but I also wanted to bring to your attention that we are having, when you leave the stakeholder meeting, there will pop up just an evaluation of the meeting that you can give us some feedback on how the stakeholder meeting was held, just to give us some feedback so we can improve the process for you at future meetings. But we'll just wait a minute or two to see if there's any further questions, and then we will leave. But we'll hang in here about a minute more, Colby, before you shut down the meeting. But I do want to thank everybody for participating and coming. But if anyone has any further questions or comments while we're waiting, that's fine. Please feel free to raise your hand or put something in the chat. But that's all we have for tonight. Okay, well, we just want to say good night and stay safe, and thank you very much again for coming.